She was a princess from a fallen kingdom, sold to the monster who conquered her lands. To the brutal warlord, she was the ultimate trophy, a broken bride, with a face cruelly scarred by tragedy. But the tyrant didn't know the truth. The scars he mocked were a masterful disguise, and the woman standing before him was not a victim, but the sole survivor of his own forgotten crime. He believed their marriage would be his greatest triumph. It would be his last. The wind changed 3 days before. They reached Drakenhold. It was a tangible thing, a shift in the world itself. The soft green air of Kiloria, rich with the scent of damp earth and river blossoms, had been stripped away, replaced by a razor-thin chill that tasted of iron and ancient stone. The carriage, once a symbol of her royal procession, now felt like a cage, its wheels groaning over a road that was less a path and more a scar carved into the mountainside. Through the thick glass, Princess Isolde watched the landscape die. Rolling hills flattened into jagged plains, and gentle oaks gave way to skeletal pines that clawed at a bruised, colorless sky. This was the north. This was her new home. The men of her father's royal guard who rode alongside the carriage sat uneasily in their saddles, their polished silver armor and emerald cloaks looking foolishly out of place in this land of granite and shadow. They were good men, brave men, but they were men of sunlight and open fields. Here, in the maw of the northern peaks, their courage was a flickering candle in a gale. Isolde knew they felt it, the same oppressive weight that settled on her own chest, a silent promise of the cruelty that awaited them at their destination. She let her hand tremble as she drew the curtain, a perfect performance for any watching eyes. Fear was expected of her. Fear was a currency she would have to spend wisely. Drakenhold did not rise from the landscape so much as it erupted from it, a shard of black mountain given a cruel and deliberate form. It was a fortress of sharp angles and merciless walls, a monument to conquest. The sound of its gates opening was a groan of tormented metal, a sound that vibrated deep in the bones. As her carriage rolled into the central courtyard, the world shrank to the jeering faces of Warlord Kaelin's soldiers. They were large men, draped in wolf pelts and dark, oiled leather, their beards braided with iron rings. They carried their axes and swords with a familiarity that spoke of a life defined by violence. They looked upon her and her Calorian escort, not as guests, but as the final spoils of a war already won. The carriage door was opened not by a page, but by one of her own guards, his movements stiff with apprehension. She descended, the chill of the courtyard seeping through her velvet traveling gown, and there he was. Warlord Kaelin, the Iron Wolf of Drakenhold, stood at the top of the keep's main steps, not bothering to descend to greet her. He was as tall and imposing as the legends claimed, with a warrior's build that even his heavy, fur-lined cloak could not conceal. But it was his face that held her gaze. It was a face of hard plains and a cruel mouth, with eyes the color of a winter storm. He did not look at her as a man looks at his betrothed. He looked at her as a butcher looks at a prize sow. She was led forward, her handmaiden Lysandra clutching her arm, a small, terrified bird in the shadow of a hawk. Isolde kept her eyes downcast, the picture of maidenly submission. She could feel his presence as he finally moved, circling her slowly. She could smell the cold steel of his armor and the wine on his breath. He stopped directly in front of her, and she knew he was staring at the ruin of her face, the web of gruesome, puckered scars that twisted from her temple down across her cheek. The silence in the courtyard was absolute, a held breath of anticipation. Then he laughed. It was not a sound of mirth, but a harsh, grating noise, like stones grinding together. The narrator would later say that in that moment, the entire north seemed to echo the sound of his contempt. He gestured to her with a sweeping hand, addressing his assembled men. He told them to behold his bride, the ravaged dove from the soft south, a perfect symbol of her kingdom's weakness. He called for wine, and when a horn was pressed into his hand, he raised it not to her, not to their future, but to the complete and utter taming of Caloria. A thunderous roar erupted from 100 throats, the sound of their victory and her humiliation crashing against the stone walls. In that moment, Isolde performed her part flawlessly. She flinched as if struck, her shoulders hunching inward. She allowed a single perfect tear to trace a path down her unblemished cheek. She was broken. She was defeated. She was exactly what he wanted her to be. But beneath the mask of the terrified victim, a different mind was at work. She was cataloging everything, the arrogant sneer on Kaelin's face, the brutish loyalty of his captain, Jorund, who laughed the loudest, the specific sigils on the banners hanging from the ramparts. Her fear was a shield, and behind it, a cold, meticulous ledger was being filled with debts that would one day be paid in full. He dismissed her with a wave, turning back to his cheering soldiers, already bored with his new prize. Lysandra, her face pale with shock and terror, guided her up the steps and into the suffocating darkness of the keep. The great hall was a cavern of shadows and cold draughts, its walls adorned with the mounted heads of massive wolves and bears, their glass eyes seeming to follow her every move. It was a hall built to celebrate predators, and she was, for now, the designated prey. They were shown to a suite of rooms at the top of a desolate tower. The chambers were large but barren, the air stale and freezing. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but it offered little warmth, its light only, serving to make the shadows in the corners dance like specters. Lysandra finally broke her silence, her voice a frantic whisper. She spoke of the Warlord's cruelty, of the barbarism of this place, her words tumbling over one another in a plea for them to be careful, to do nothing to provoke the beast. Isolde, in turn, offered her handmaiden words of comfort she did not feel. The narrator would observe her stroking Lysandra's hair, telling her that they must simply endure, that their survival depended on their obedience. It was a lie, but a necessary one. Once Lysandra had finally settled into a state of resigned despair, Isolde moved to the chamber's only mirror, a large plate of polished silver. She stared at her reflection. She saw the timid princess, the broken girl, the ravaged dove. But then, as the firelight flickered, the fear in her eyes dissolved, replaced by something ancient and hard as the stone of the fortress itself. Her fingers traced the elegant, horrifying lines of the scars she had so carefully crafted months ago. They were a masterpiece of alchemy and pain, her greatest creation. They were the reason she was still alive. They were the reason Warlord Kaelin would soon be dead. The narrator would conclude that the Iron Wolf had made many mistakes in his conquests, but his gravest, most fatal error was in believing the monster he saw in the mirror was not of his own making. The days that followed her arrival bled into a monotonous cycle of dread. Drakkenhold did not sleep. The fortress was a living thing, its stone heart pumping a constant rhythm of grinding smithing hammers, the drunken songs of off-duty soldiers, and the sharp echoing commands of their captains. For Princess Isolde, it was a symphony of her own captivity. She learned to walk with her head bowed, to make her presence as small and unobtrusive as a mouse in a den of wolves. Her fear, the exquisite mask she never took off, became her shield. It made her uninteresting, and, in a place where interest often led to pain, being uninteresting was a form of survival. Her handmaiden, Lysandra, did not possess such discipline. The girl's terror was genuine, a raw nerve that thrummed constantly. Every loud noise made her jump. Every passing soldier caused her to shrink against the wall. She was a mirror of the fear Isolde was supposed to feel, and her presence was both a comfort and a constant, dangerous liability. It was Lysandra's palpable fear that drew the attention of Jorund, the Warlord's brutish second-in-command. He found them in a high-arched corridor as they made their way back from the dreary sept. Jorund blocked their path, a mountain of muscle and foul-smelling leather. He grinned, a predator's expression that did not touch his cold, flat eyes. The narrator would recall his words, how he commented on the finery of Calorian silks, wondering aloud if such delicate things could withstand a northern winter, or a northern man. As he spoke, he gestured with a horn of ale, accidentally sloshing its contents down the front of Isolde's gown. The dark liquid soaked the emerald fabric, a stain like a fresh bruise. He did not apologize. He only watched, his grin widening as Isolde stammered a pathetic apology of her own and hurried away, pulling the trembling Lysandra with her. The act was small, a casual bit of bullying, but its message was clear. You have no dignity here that we do not allow you. The warlord himself preferred grander, more theatrical cruelties. A few days before the scheduled wedding, he summoned Isolde to the great hall before his entire court. He was seated on his throne, a monstrous thing of black iron and carved dragon bone. He was in a fine mood, which was always a prelude to some vicious act. He announced to all that he had procured a special wedding gift for his bride, something to honor her heritage. He gestured, and 2 soldiers hauled a heavy, splintered wooden chest before her, dropping it on the stone. Floor with a loud crack, Kaelin commanded her to open it. With every eye in the hall on her, Isolde knelt, her hands shaking for real this time. The lid was heavy. She lifted it, and for a moment she could not breathe. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dirty straw, was the grand battle standard of the kingdom of Caloria. It was not a replica. It was the very banner that had flown above her father's command tent, the golden sun and falcon emblem now barely visible beneath layers of dirt, grime, and a large dark stain that could only be old blood. Its staff was broken, its silken edges tattered and torn. Kaelin's voice boomed from the throne. He told her it was a reminder, so that in the warmth of his bed she would never forget where she came from and who she belonged to now. The hall, after a moment of stunned silence, erupted in sycophantic laughter. The narrator would linger on this image, the princess kneeling before the symbol of her annihilated home, her face a mask of stunned horror. She was forced to thank him. The words felt like swallowing glass, but she said them, her voice a choked whisper. She accepted his gift. She and Lysandra carried the heavy, desecrated banner back to their chambers, the laughter of the court following them down the long, cold corridors. Inside their room, they unfolded the standard on the floor. To see it so dishonored, this sacred emblem of her family's legacy, was a pain deeper than any physical blow. Lysandra began to weep silently, her shoulders shaking with the grief of a lost nation. But as Isolde stared at the ruined falcon, something inside her shifted. The sorrow, white-hot and sharp, did not break her. It fired her. It hardened the core of her resolve into something akin to the black iron of the fortress itself. This was not just an insult. It was a desecration of memory, an act so profoundly vile it purified her purpose. Vengeance was no longer just a desire. It was now a sacred duty. In that moment, kneeling in a cold tower in a hostile land, she was the last vestige of Caloria's honor. She felt utterly alone, a single spark of rebellion in an ocean of darkness, a forgotten princess in a kingdom of wolves. The narrator might ask, who remembers the fallen when the conquerors write the histories? But perhaps, beyond those stone walls, a story is more resilient than a fortress. If you believe that one person's courage can turn the tide of fate, you can show that belief. Let the silent princess know she is not forgotten by clicking the like button on this story. Fueled by this cold new fire, Isolde understood that she could no longer be a passive prisoner. To wait for the wedding was to wait for the executioner. She needed to understand her cage, not just endure it. She began to walk. Using her persona as a timid lost girl, she explored the labyrinthine corridors of Drakenhold. She learned the rhythms of the castle, the changing of the guard, the routes to the kitchens, and the armory, the quiet, forgotten hallways where no one ever seemed to go. The soldiers who saw her saw only a pathetic figure, Kaelin's broken toy, and they paid her no mind. The narrator would reveal, however, that with every step, she was not wandering, but mapping. With every downcast glance, she was not afraid, but observing. She was a strategist pacing out her battlefield. It was during one of these calculated explorations in a wing of the castle that seemed mostly used for storage that she found it. A heavy door of iron-banded oak, far more ornate than the others around it. It was a door that spoke of importance, of secrets. As she drew near, she noted it was not fully latched. A sliver of light escaped from the crack, and with it the sound of a voice. It was Kaelin's, loud and boastful, recounting some past victory to a companion. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to return to the relative safety of her tower, but a stronger, colder impulse took hold. It was the instinct of the hunter who has just stumbled upon the lair of its prey. She had to know what was inside. Pressing herself flat against the cold stone wall, Princess Isolde held her breath, straining to listen. The voice from behind the heavy oak door was unmistakably Kaelin's, thick with arrogance, as he recounted a tale of slaughter on the Western Front. It was the voice of a man reliving his own glories, a sound she had come to loathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings against the cage of her chest. Every instinct, honed by weeks of survival, screamed at her to retreat, to melt back into the shadows and return to the cold safety of her tower. To be discovered here, snooping at the door of his private chambers, would be a fatal error. But a different impulse, colder and far more compelling, held her fast. It was the same instinct that drove her to explore the fortress, a burning need to understand the mind of her captor, to know the shape of the monster she was sworn to marry. The voice moved away, its booming tones fading down an adjacent corridor, followed by the heavy tread of his companion's boots. The moment of immediate danger had passed. He was gone. She was alone. Pushing down her fear, she placed a hand on the iron-banded door and pushed. It swung inward with a low, well-oiled whisper, revealing the room beyond. It was not a study or a solar. It was a chapel, consecrated to his own. Vanity. A trophy room. The air within was still and cold, heavy with the silent weight of stolen histories. Banners of conquered clans and minor kingdoms hung from the high vaulted ceiling like captured ghosts. Priceless works of art, plundered from a dozen different cultures, were stacked carelessly in corners. Suits of armor from vanquished champions stood like hollow sentinels along the walls. The narrator would later reflect that it was a room built not to remember victories, but to gloat over the defeats of others. It was the heart of Kaelin's darkness, a museum of sorrow. Isolde stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The mask of the timid girl fell away, replaced by an expression of intense, focused curiosity. She moved through the space with a quiet grace, her eyes scanning every object. She saw the silver diadem of the last queen of the Dell, the ceremonial shield of a Fenrir chieftain, the gilded harp of a famous Kylorian bard. Each item was a story of loss, a tragedy that mirrored her own. She felt a kinship with these dead, silenced objects, a shared experience of being subjugated by the warlord's greed. Her anger, a constant simmering ember within her, burned a little hotter. Her gaze was then drawn to the center of the room, to a long table of polished black wood, its surface protected by a thick sheet of glass. This was where he kept his most personal treasures. Here were the smaller, more intimate spoils of his conquests. The signet, rings of dead lords, pendants torn from the necks of their wives, and a fearsome collection of ornate daggers. She leaned closer, her eyes tracing the lines of the wicked little blades, each one a masterpiece of deadly art. And then she saw it. It lay separate from the others, centered on a small cushion of black velvet. It was a dagger of exquisite craftsmanship. Its blade was dark, forged from some strange, star-fallen metal. The hilt was carved from polished weirwood, but it was the pommel that made her blood turn to ice. Set into the very end of the hilt was a single, oblong fire opal. It was a unique gem, one that seemed to capture a living flame in its milky depths, a swirling vortex of orange and red. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her carefully constructed composure shattered. The sight of the gem threw her back in time, the memory assaulting her, not as a distant dream, but as a visceral, waking nightmare. The narrator would describe the sudden, suffocating sensation of the past becoming the present. She could smell the pine needles and damp earth of the Calorian woods. She could feel the biting cold of the autumn air on her skin. She remembered the ambush, the sudden violence erupting from the quiet of the forest. She remembered the struggle, the man's heavy weight, the stench of sweat and leather. And she remembered looking up, seeing the glint of his weapon in the moonlight just before it struck. She remembered the fire opal, burning like a malevolent eye, the last thing she saw before the world dissolved into searing, blinding pain. The memory released her, and she stumbled back from the display case, gasping for air, a hand flying to the scarred side of her face. The logic was simple, brutal, and undeniable. That dagger, the one that had torn her flesh and nearly ended her life, was here. It was here in Kaelin's private collection. It was his. The man who had attacked her in the woods all those years ago, the nameless assassin she had believed to be a random border raider, was not nameless at all. It was him, Warlord Kaelin, her betrothed. The narrator would say that in this moment, the girl she had once been and the frightened woman she had pretended to be both died forever. The foundation of her reality had crumbled. This was not the random cruelty of war. This was a specific, personal, and premeditated act of assassination. He had tried to murder her long before he ever declared war on her kingdom. He had hunted her down like an animal, and he had failed. He had let her live, never imagining that the scarred, broken creature he later took as a prize was the same girl he had left for dead. She looked at the dagger again. The fear was gone, burned away by a rage so pure and so absolute it felt like serenity. Her purpose, which had been a murky thing of survival and a vague sense of national vengeance, was now crystalline. This was not about a kingdom anymore. This was about a girl in a forest and the monster who tried to kill her. A quick death in battle, a knife in the dark. These were the tools of common assassins. They were too good for him. A warrior's end was an honor he had not earned. No, her revenge had to be a mirror of his crime. It had to be meticulous. It had to be intimate. It had to be cruel. It needed a weapon that did not just kill, but dismantled. A weapon that would attack him from the inside out, making him feel the slow, creeping terror he had meant for her. In the silent, cold trophy room, surrounded by the ghosts of his victims, Princess Isolde realized she did not need a sword, she needed a poison, and she knew, with sudden, absolute clarity, where she might find one. She left the trophy room as a different woman than the one who had entered. The ghost of the frightened princess, a role she had inhabited for so long, had been exorcised by the fire of a single, undeniable truth. As she walked back through the cold, winding corridors of Drakenhold, the fortress no longer seemed like a cage. It was now a hunting ground, and she, for the first time, was no longer the prey. The narrator would say that the air itself seemed to part for her, the shadows shrinking from the new cold light in her eyes. Her steps were no longer the hesitant shuffle of a victim, but the measured, deliberate pace of an executioner on her way to build a scaffold. Back in the tower room, Lysandra was mending the gown Jorund had stained, her small, precise stitches a testament to her quiet resilience. She looked up as Isolde entered, her eyes wide with the constant, simmering fear she lived with. She asked if her lady was all right, if the warlord had summoned her again. Isolde looked at her handmaiden, this last loyal piece of her old life, and felt a pang of something akin to pity. The girl lived in a world of simple monsters, of brutish men and overt cruelties. She could never comprehend the intricate, layered evil that Isolde had just uncovered. To tell her the truth would be a cruelty in itself, a burden her gentle spirit could not bear. So Isolde lied. She told Lysandra that she had simply been exploring, that she had lost her way. She adopted the familiar mask of weariness and sorrow, a performance that was now second nature. But inwardly, her mind was a whirlwind of cold, precise calculation. The narrator would describe it as a master artisan laying out their tools. The shock had passed, and in its place was a profound and terrifying clarity. Kaelin had not just conquered her kingdom. He had tried to erase her from existence. His crime was not one of war, but of assassination, and the punishment must fit the crime. A quick death, a knife in the ribs during a moment of passion, was too clean, too merciful. It was a warrior's death, and he was no warrior. He was a coward who attacked girls in the woods. No, her revenge had to be a work of art. It had to be slow. It had to be personal. It had to be a poison that would unravel him from the inside out, a creeping sickness that would steal his legendary strength, cloud his mind with paranoia, and make him feel the same helpless, creeping dread that he had intended for her. He would watch himself decay. He would feel his power slipping through his trembling fingers like sand. He would become a prisoner in his own body, a king of a dying empire of flesh. And she, his meek, scarred bride, would be the one to watch over his decline, her feigned sympathy, the final exquisite twist of the knife. The plan was audacious, it was monstrous, and it filled her with a sense of purpose so powerful it was almost euphoric. But a plan, no matter how perfect, required the right tools. Where, in this fortress of brutes and iron, could she procure a poison so subtle, so sophisticated? Her mind raced, sifting through weeks of observation, of overheard conversations, of the servants' gossip she had so carefully collected. She remembered the Calorian prisoners, the ones Kaelin sometimes used for sport in the training yard. Most were soldiers, but she recalled hearing whispers of others, craftsmen and scholars deemed too valuable to kill outright, now languishing in the dungeons below the fortress. And then a name surfaced from the depths of her memory, a spark in the darkness: Master Tariq. He had been the royal alchemist of Caloria, a quiet, brilliant man who had been her tutor in the botanical arts when she was a young girl. He was a master of not just tinctures and medicines, but of their dark twins, the subtle poisons that could mimic disease, that could kill without leaving a trace. The Northmen, in their ignorance, would have seen him as little more than a court magician, a maker of potions. They would not have understood the true, deadly extent of his knowledge. Was it possible? Could he be here, alive, in the dungeons of this very castle? The possibility took root in her mind and grew into a certainty. Kaelin, in his arrogance, would have kept such a man alive, seeing him as another trophy, another tool to be potentially used and discarded. Finding him was now the singular focus of her existence. Her grand, elaborate plan for revenge now had a concrete first step. She had to get into the dungeons. She had to find Master Tariq, and she had to convince him to help her commit treason and murder. She stood before the hearth, staring into the flames, her mind alight with strategy. She was one woman alone and surrounded by enemies. To succeed would require a level of cunning and courage she had never before been forced to summon. She would have to use their perception of her as a weapon, her supposed weakness as her greatest strength. They saw a broken doll, a creature of fear and submission. They would never suspect the mind that worked behind the scarred face, the cold, calculating heart that beat within the fragile frame. The narrator might pause here to reflect on the nature of power. The world sees it in crowns, in armies, in fortresses of stone. But true power, the kind that can topple empires, often begins as a secret, a silent resolve in the heart of someone the world has already dismissed. It is a quiet promise made to oneself in the dark. If you have ever felt the fire of a hidden strength, the belief that even the most formidable walls can be brought down from within, then you understand the journey this princess is about to undertake. Let your voice be a part of her silent rebellion. Tell us in the comments what city or what kingdom you are watching her story from. Her path was now clear. She would no longer wander the castle as a lost soul. Every step would have a purpose. Every conversation would be a mission for intelligence. She would learn the guards' routines, She would map the routes to the dungeons. She would find a way to get to Tariq, to offer him a pact forged in their shared desire for Calorian justice. The fear was gone, replaced by a chilling patience. She had waited years for this, living a lie behind a mask of her own making. She could wait a little longer. The Iron Wolf of Drakenhold thought he was marrying a lamb. He was about to learn that he had invited a serpent into his bed, and its fangs were already dripping with the promise of a slow, agonizing death. The plan, once formed, took on a life of its own, a relentless engine driving Isolde's every action. Her days were no longer spent in aimless, fearful wandering. They were expeditions. The narrator would describe her movements as a masterful performance in feigned fragility. She would drift through the castle's corridors, her hand often pressed to her scarred cheek as if in pain, her eyes wide and lost. Guards and servants alike would see the warlord's pathetic, shell-shocked bride and quickly look away, affording her the very invisibility she now craved. But behind the mask of a broken woman, she was a cartographer of her own prison, memorizing the architecture of her revenge. Her objective was the dungeons. She knew from the castle's layout that they lay deep beneath the main barracks, a heavily trafficked area where a princess would have no business. To even approach it would invite suspicion. She needed a legitimate reason to be there, an excuse so flawless it would withstand scrutiny. She would create one. Taking Lysandra with her on a supposed walk to the castle sept, Isolde feigned confusion, taking a deliberate wrong turn that led them down a flight of cold, damp stone steps. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and the unmistakable scent of masculine aggression. They were nearing the barracks' lower levels. It was time. Just as two guards, their faces grim and bearded, rounded a corner ahead, Isolde put her plan into motion. The narrator would capture the artistry of the act. She let out a small, almost inaudible gasp. Her free hand flew to her temple, and the color drained from her face, a trick of breath control and mental focus she had practiced for hours. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed, not in an unseemly heap, but in a graceful, flowing swoon that sent Lysandra into a genuine fit of panicked cries. The guards, annoyed but duty-bound, rushed forward. Their grudging concern was the perfect cover. As one guard helped a frantic Lysandra lift her, and the other grumbled about the inconvenience, Isolde's mind, sharp and clear, absorbed everything. She feigned a dazed unconsciousness, her head lolling against her handmaiden's shoulder. She heard the guards complaining about the long hours of their patrol, one mentioning that he was relieved their shift change was coming at the tolling of the evening bell. She noted the heavy, rhythmic tread of 4 pairs of boots, not 2, meaning the patrols here were larger than elsewhere. The echo of their voices told her the corridor was long and narrow. It was invaluable intelligence, gathered from a moment of manufactured weakness. Later, back in their tower, the second phase began. Isolde knew she could not descend into the dungeons alone. She needed a diversion, a fire loud enough to draw the guards away from their posts. She needed Lysandra. The narrator would detail the difficult, carefully staged conversation. Isolde did not reveal the truth of her murderous intent. She presented a picture of desperate sorrow. She told her handmaiden that she could not bear the thought of the wedding night, that she needed a powerful sleeping draught to simply survive it. She confessed with tears in her eyes that she had learned Master Tariq was alive in the dungeons, and that he was the only one who could help her. She framed the entire plot as a quest for peace, not for blood. She then laid out the plan. At the precise moment the evening bell began to toll, signaling the guard shift she now knew about, Lysandra was to go to a linen storage closet near the kitchens, a place on the opposite side of the fortress. There she was to accidentally knock over a candle. A small fire, she explained, just enough smoke to cause confusion, to create a window of opportunity. Lysandra was horrified, her loyalty at war with her terror. But looking at her princess, at the haunted, desperate look in her eyes, a look Isolde had perfected just for this moment, The girl's loyalty won. She tearfully agreed. As the sun bled out of the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across Drakenhold, the evening bell began its solemn, clanging toll. The narrator would build the tension, cutting between two scenes. In a remote corridor, Lysandra, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold the candle, crept toward the linen closet. In the tower room, Isolde, cloaked in dark wool, slipped out the door, a shadow moving through shadows. A moment later, a faint, acrid smell began to drift through the halls, followed by the distant, muffled shouts of alarm. The diversion had begun. Isolde moved with a speed and confidence that would have astonished her. Chapters, every turn, every staircase, every shadow was a landmark on her mental map. As she descended toward the dungeons, she saw the proof of her planned success. The main guard post at the dungeon entrance was empty, its occupants drawn away by the commotion. She slipped past it, lifting a heavy iron ring to open the door, and descended into the abyss. The dungeon was a place of profound misery. The air was thick with the stench of despair and damp stone. Water dripped from the ceiling in a maddeningly irregular rhythm. Soft moans and whispered prayers echoed from the darkness of the cells. Holding a small, shielded candle, Isolde moved down the row of iron-barred doors, peering into the gloom. She saw the faces of her father's soldiers, now gaunt and hollow-eyed, and her resolve hardened further. At the very end of the corridor, in the deepest, darkest cell, she found him. He was little more than a skeleton, his once fine robes now tattered rags, his hair and beard a wild matted tangle. But his eyes, when they caught the light of her candle, were not broken. They were sharp, intelligent, and widened in utter disbelief. He whispered her name, a sound of pure astonishment. Master Tariq was alive. She knelt before his cell, the princess before the prisoner. Their conversation, as reported by the narrator, was a hushed, desperate torrent of words. He was horrified not just by her presence in this terrible place, but by her request. Poison. For the warlord? It was madness. It was suicide. She did not tell him about the dagger. She did not tell him her revenge was personal. Instead, she spoke of Keloria. She spoke of the desecrated banner that now hung in her room. She framed her request not as murder, but as a righteous act of war, a sacred duty to their king, their people, and their gods. She commanded him, as her royal alchemist and as a subject of the true crown, to forge the weapon she needed to free them all. The plea, a potent mixture of royal authority and raw desperation, finally broke through his caution. His duty, he realized, was to his kingdom, and she was its last best hope. He agreed. He confessed that when he was captured, he had managed to conceal a small leather-wrapped kit of essential compounds, the rarest and most potent seeds of his craft. He told her he could create what she needed, a poison of unparalleled subtlety, a concoction that would mimic a wasting sickness, leaving no trace. But he needed one day to prepare it. The pact was sealed through the cold iron bars of the cell. Isolde rose, her mission accomplished. She left the dungeons as quietly as she had come, leaving Tariq to his secret, deadly work. The narrator would conclude that she walked back into the light of the castle, not just with a plan, but with a promise. The weapon was no longer a desperate hope. It was being forged in the darkness beneath her enemy's feet. The day after the fire was one of restless unease in Drakenhold. The official story, settled upon by the castle stewards, was that of a servant's carelessness, a dropped candle in a linen closet. But a low-grade suspicion lingered in the air, a sense that something was not quite right. This lingering confusion was the perfect cloak for Isolde. It made the guards less observant, their minds preoccupied with the incident. It allowed her to move through the fortress with a newfound boldness, her purpose a silent, invisible shield. That evening she made her second ascent into the castle's dark underbelly. The narrator would note the difference in this journey. There was no hesitation, no feigned confusion. Her steps were sure and swift, her path direct. She was no longer an explorer. She was a conspirator keeping a critical appointment. She reached Master Tariq's cell, the darkness and misery of the dungeon no longer affecting her. She had a singular focus. The old alchemist was waiting, his face pressed against the cold iron bars, his eyes burning with a mixture of fear and fierce resolve. He had made his choice. Without a word he passed 2 small vials through the bars. They were tiny, easily concealed in the palm of a hand. One contained a liquid as clear and unassuming as water. The other held a fluid the color of milk. The narrator would report Tariq's whispered, urgent instructions. The clear liquid he named, the vespertine toxin. It was a neurotoxin of unparalleled subtlety, distilled from a rare mountain flower that bloomed only in moonlight. It would not kill quickly. It would mimic a slow, wasting sickness, fraying the nerves, clouding the mind, and gradually stealing a man's strength. He warned that the dose must be precise, just a few drops each day, to allow the poison to build within the Warlord's system without alerting him. Then he held up the second vial. This, he explained, was the only antidote in the known world. It would halt the poison's effects and flush it from the body, but it had to be administered before the final stage, before the victim's heart finally gave out. He was entrusting her with the power of life and death in its purest form. Isolde took the vials, her fingers closing around them. They felt cold, heavy with the weight of their purpose. She gave the alchemist a single, sharp nod of understanding. A pact of silent, deadly treason was now fulfilled. The first opportunity came that very night. As the wedding grew closer, Kalen had taken to dining with her in his private solar, a move meant to display his ownership. He sat across from her, gorging himself on roasted meat and wine, boasting of a recent skirmish where his men had slaughtered a band of rebels. He was in high spirits, oblivious. He drained his goblet and slammed it on the table, commanding her to pour him more. A servant brought the heavy ornate pitcher and, with a bow, placed it on the table beside Isolde. As the future lady of the castle, it was her place to serve him. The narrator would zoom in on this moment, the turning point from which there was no return. Isolde rose, her movements fluid and graceful. For a moment her back was to him as she reached for the pitcher. In that single, shielded instant, her hand moved with the speed and precision of a striking snake. The tiny cork came free, and 3 clear drops of Vesper's kiss fell silently into the deep red wine. She swirled the pitcher once, a casual gesture, then filled his goblet to the brim. She placed it before him, her expression a perfect mask of demure obedience. She watched, her heart a cold, steady drum as he lifted the goblet to his lips and drank deeply. He noticed nothing. He complimented the wine's richness, then continued his bloody tale. He had no idea that he had just swallowed the first seed of his own demise. Isolde had crossed her final river. She was a killer now. The poison was a patient artist. For the first 2 days there was nothing. Then the subtle changes began. The narrator would describe Kalen waking with a dull, persistent ache behind his eyes. He grew irritable, his temper, always volatile, now flaring at the slightest provocation. Then came the tremor. During a meeting of his war council, he reached for a map, and for a split second his hand shook, a tremor so slight only he could feel it. He clenched his fist, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, but dismissed it as fatigue. The first public sign came a week after the first dose. In the training yard, the one place where Kalen's dominance had always been absolute and terrifying, he faced Jorund in their customary sparring match. He moved with his usual arrogance, but his body betrayed him. His timing was off. He misjudged a parry, his feet felt clumsy, and he stumbled. In that moment of imbalance, Jorund's blunted practice sword slapped harmlessly against his chest, but the blow to his pride was catastrophic. The entire yard fell silent. Kalen exploded in a torrent of fury, roaring that Jorund had cheated, that he had taken a cheap shot. His face was purple with a rage born of pure, undiluted humiliation. That incident planted the poison of paranoia deep in the court's psyche. Kalen's trust in his own men began to rot. He saw insults in their silence and plots in their whispers. He accused his treasurer of skimming funds. He berated his spymaster for failing to uncover conspiracies that existed only in his own mind. His legendary strength was failing, and his authority, which was built entirely on that strength, was beginning to crumble. His men no longer looked at him with just fear. They looked at him with a new, dangerous pity, whispering about the warlord's health, his sanity. The breaking point came during the evening meal in the great hall. Kalen, stewing in his own frustration and rage, heard a whispered comment and a stifled laugh from a nearby table. He rose to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. He slammed his fist on the great oak table, the sound echoing like a thunderclap through the hall. He glared at the faces of his court, his eyes wild and suspicious. The narrator would report his bellowed proclamation. He was tired of the whispers, of the weakling Calorians infecting his court with their softness. He declared the wedding would not wait. It would be the next night. He would take his bride, consummate their union, and show them all that the Iron Wolf was as powerful as ever. His gaze swept across the hall and locked onto Isolde. It was a look of desperate, possessive hunger. In her he saw the solution to his ailment, the public act that would silence the doubters and restore his virility in their eyes. The narrator would conclude that he stared at the woman he believed to be the cure for his mysterious sickness, having no idea he was looking directly at its cause. In his desperate attempt to reassert his power, Warlord Kalen had just set the date for his own execution. The wedding was a funeral in disguise. The great hall of Drakenhold, normally a place of boisterous, chaotic energy, was subdued, thick with a tension that had nothing to do with matrimonial joy. The narrator would describe the scene as a grim tableau. Warlord Kalen stood before the northern priest, his face a ghastly shade of pale beneath his beard, a fine sheen of sweat glistening on his brow. His grip on Isolde's arm was less a lover's touch and more the desperate clutch of a drowning man. He was trying to project an image of indomitable strength, but his unsteadiness and the slight tremor in his hands told a different story. The poison was accelerating its work, and his court could see it. They watched him, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a new, predatory curiosity. Isolde, by contrast, was a vision of perfect, tragic submission. Draped in the dark, heavy silks of the north, her scarred face downcast, she played her part as the sacrificial bride to perfection. She trembled when she was supposed to tremble. She spoke her vows in a voice so soft and broken it was barely audible. Inside, however, her mind was a sea of absolute tranquility. Every beat of her heart was a countdown. Every moment of this sham ceremony was one step closer to the true consummation she had planned for this night. When the grim affair was concluded, Kalen wasted no time. He practically dragged her from the hall, his possessiveness on full display for his whispering court. He needed to finish this, to take her, to perform the act of dominance he believed would restore his fading power and silence the doubts of his men. They walked in silence, a predator leading his lamb to a private slaughter. He shoved open the heavy doors to his personal bedchamber and pulled her inside. The room was an extension of its owner, large, opulent, and barbaric, dominated by a massive bed draped in black wolf pelts and a hearth large enough to roast a boar. He turned to the two guards who had followed them. The narrator would report his command barked with a slurred, angry edge. He told them to leave, to stand guard outside the door, and allow no one to enter until morning for any reason. He wanted no witnesses for what was to come. He wanted to be entirely alone with his broken prize. The guards bowed and withdrew, the heavy oak door thudding shut behind them, the sound of a bolt being drawn a definitive note of finality. The trap was now sealed. They were alone. Kalen turned to her, a sneer twisting his lips. He began to speak, his voice a low, menacing rumble. He told her the farce was over. He spoke of her scars, how he had enjoyed her fear, and how, on this night, he would finally break her completely, just as he had broken her kingdom. He took a step towards her, his eyes burning with a feverish, desperate lust. He was a man trying to conquer his own mortality by conquering her. This was the moment. The final act had begun. Isolde did not retreat. Instead, she turned from him, a seemingly submissive gesture, and moved towards the ornate vanity table where her perfumes and brushes were laid out. He watched, a cruel smile on his face, assuming she was preparing herself for him, but she did not reach for a bottle of perfume. Her fingers closed around a small, unmarked crystal vial she had hidden there earlier, a vial filled with a clear, oily liquid. It was the solvent Master Tariq had provided. She uncorked it, dabbed a small amount onto a silk cloth, and turned back to face him. As he watched, his smug expression beginning to falter into confusion, she lifted the cloth to her face. The narrator would describe the surreal, horrifying transformation. She began to wipe at the edges of her scars, but they did not just smudge. Under the effects of the powerful solvent, the carefully crafted alchemical tissue began to soften, to peel away from the perfect skin underneath. In moments, a large piece came loose, and she pulled it away like a mask, revealing the smooth, unblemished cheek of a stranger. Kalen stared, his poison-addled mind refusing to process what he was seeing. He took a stumbling step back, his mouth agape. The scarred, broken girl was gone, replaced by a woman of breathtaking, unfamiliar beauty, her expression not one of fear, but of chilling, regal calm. Before he could form a word, she spoke. Her voice, as reported by the narrator, was unrecognizable. It was not the whisper of a frightened mouse, but the clear, cold tone of a queen passing judgment. She told him she understood his confusion, that he would not recognize her face without the art that he himself had inspired. She asked him if he remembered a moonlit night in the Calorian woods many years ago. She spoke of an ambush, of a girl traveling with a small escort. She described the weight of an attacker, the flash of a blade. She described a unique dagger, a beautiful and deadly thing with a single fire opal burning in its pommel. With every word, Kalen's face shifted from confusion to a dawning, sickening horror. His mind, fighting through the fog of the toxin, was finally connecting the pieces. He remembered the raid. He remembered the girl. He remembered the dagger, the one that now sat in his trophy room. Isolde let the silence hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final, fatal blow to his sanity. She met his terrified gaze, and for the first time, she allowed her face to show the full, undiluted depth of her hatred. She told him her name, her true name, and that she was the girl he had failed to kill, the ghost he had unknowingly brought into his own home. The revelation struck the warlord with the force of a physical assault. A raw, guttural roar of pure disbelief and fury tore from his throat. His mind snapped. All reason fled, replaced by a singular primal urge to destroy the impossible truth standing before him. He lunged, not with the calculated attack of a warrior, but with the clumsy, frantic desperation of a cornered beast. He meant to tear her apart, but his body, ravaged for weeks by Vesper's kiss, gave out completely. His legs buckled under him. The strength vanished from his limbs. His lunge turned into a pathetic, stumbling fall. The narrator would describe the final ignominious collapse. Warlord Kalen, the Iron Wolf, the conqueror of kingdoms, crashed to the stone floor at her feet. He landed hard on his hands and knees, his head hung low, gasping for breath, his muscles refusing to obey him. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been utterly and irrevocably shattered. He looked up at her from the floor, no longer a warlord, no longer a predator, but a helpless, paralyzed wretch, completely and utterly at the mercy of his greatest failure. He knelt on the floor before her, a titan brought low, his body a prison, and his mind a maelstrom of horrified disbelief. The great warlord Kalen, who had broken nations with fire and sword, was now paralyzed at the feet of a ghost, Princess Jun. Isolde stood over him, not with the triumphant fire of a warrior, but with the dispassionate calm of a scholar observing a failed experiment. Her voice, when she spoke again, was devoid of emotion, a clinical recitation of his doom. The narrator would report her words as a slow, deliberate dissection of his suffering. She told him about the Vesper's kiss, the beautiful name she had given to the clear liquid he had so greedily consumed in his wine night after night. She catalogued his decline. With chilling precision, the headaches he dismissed as fatigue, the tremor in his hand he tried to hide, the confusion that clouded his counsels, the humiliating failure in the training yard. She explained that every pang of pain, every moment of weakness, every flicker of paranoia was a carefully measured gift from her, a small taste of the helpless terror he had meant for her to feel. As she spoke, the last vestiges of his pride crumbled, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He was not just being defeated, he was being unmade, his own body turned into an instrument of his enemy's vengeance. It was then, as he stared up at her, his eyes wide with the horror of understanding, that she produced the second vial. It was the small bottle containing the milky white fluid, and she held it up so it caught the firelight. The narrator would describe the desperate animal hope that flared in Kalen's eyes. He was a dying man who had just been shown a miracle. Isolde told him what it was, an antidote, the only cure for the poison that was even now crystallizing in his veins. She told him it would flush the toxin from his system, that it would give him back his life. He could have it, but it came at a price. He had to earn it. He had to beg. She commanded him to renounce his name, his titles, his conquests. He had to strip himself of every shred of his arrogance and plead for his life, not as a warlord, but as the pathetic, nameless coward he truly was. For a moment, a war raged within him. The narrator would capture the violent conflict in his expression, the ingrained pride of a conqueror battling the terrified, biological imperative to live. He tried to muster a curse, a final act of defiance, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the poison's grip and his own overwhelming fear. The fear won. The iron wolf broke. A low, guttural sound escaped his lips, a sound that was half sob, half whimper. He began to beg. The words started as a whispered plea for mercy, then grew into a desperate, incoherent babble. He groveled on the stone floor, his body trembling uncontrollably. He renounced his name. He cursed his own ambition. He pleaded with the ghost of the girl he had tried to kill, offering her anything, everything, his entire kingdom, in exchange for the milky white liquid in that vial. It was the ultimate humiliation, the complete and total annihilation of the man he had been. Isolde watched his pathetic display, her face a mask of cold composure. She let him grovel until his voice was raw, until his pleas were nothing more than the wet, gasping sounds of a dying animal. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she knelt before him. He looked up, his face awash with tears and desperate, grateful relief. She had heard him. She would save him. She uncorked the vial. With his eyes fixed on hers, she turned the bottle upside down and poured the entire contents of the antidote onto the cold stone floor. The milky fluid pooled for a moment, an iridescent promise, before seeping into the cracks between the stones, lost forever. The hope in Kalen's eyes died instantly, replaced by a look of pure, soul-shattering despair, a void so absolute it was more terrifying than any rage. Before he could even scream, she moved. From a concealed sheath on her thigh, she produced a dagger. The narrator would linger on the details of the weapon. It was a perfect, flawless replica of the dagger in his trophy room, right down to the oblong fire opal that burned in its pommel. She told him, her voice now a soft, deadly whisper, that a captive Calorian smith had forged it for her, a final piece of her homeland's retribution. She leaned in close and told him that this was the justice he had earned in the woods. This was for the girl he had left for dead. And then, with a single, swift, and mercifully final thrust, she ended his life. The narrator would pause, allowing the silence of the chamber to settle, broken only by the crackling of the deep fire. Justice, in the end, was not delivered by a king's decree or a god's judgment, but by the steady, avenging hand of the woman they had all tried to erase. Her story is a testament that the deepest wounds can forge the strongest weapons, that the fire of resilience can burn down any fortress. If you believe that a single determined soul can change the course of history, then subscribe to this channel and witness how she rebuilds a world from the ashes of her revenge. Isolde stood, the eye-bead, bloody dagger in her hand. Her personal vengeance was complete. The monster was dead, but the war was not over. Her people were not free. Outside the heavy oak door stood two of the Warlord's personal guards, men loyal to the memory of the tyrant she had just slain. Her mission had now entered its next, most dangerous phase. With a calm, methodical motion, she wiped the blade clean on the furs of the bed. Her mind, clear and cold, was already calculating the next move. She turned to face the doctor, her expression resolute. The queen was ready to claim her castle. The body of the Iron Wolf lay cooling on the stone floor, a monument to a fallen era. But outside the chamber door, his power lingered in the form of two loyal, heavily armed guards. The narrator would observe that this was the first test of Isolde's new reign, a battle to be won not with strength, but with the weapon she had perfected, deception. Her personal vengeance was sated, but the liberation of her people required her to once again don a mask. She concealed the bloody dagger in the folds of her gown, took a deep, steadying breath, and composed her face into a portrait of pure, frantic terror. She stumbled to the door, pounding on the heavy oak with her fists. Her voice, when she called out, was a high-pitched, convincing shriek of panic. She cried that the Warlord had collapsed, that he was not breathing, that something was terribly wrong. She begged for help. Outside, the guards exchanged a confused, alarmed glance. They knew their lord had been unwell, his behavior erratic. The sounds of genuine distress from his new bride were enough to override their orders to remain outside. They drew the heavy bolt. The moment the door swung inward, their eyes went straight to the sight of their master lying motionless on the floor. Their training, their loyalty, it all compelled them to rush to his side, their minds momentarily blank to any other threat. It was the single moment of distraction Isolde had planned for. From the deep shadows beside the hearth where they had been hiding, two figures emerged. The first was Master Tariq, his eyes burning with a righteous fire, holding a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. The second was a tall, gaunt Calorian, one of the former royal guards freed from the dungeons. As Kaelin's men knelt over his body, they were set upon from behind. The attack was silent, swift, and brutal. The guards collapsed without a sound. The immediate threat was neutralized. The narrator would then reveal the full scope of the plan Isolde had set in motion. Freeing Tariq was not just about acquiring a poison, it was about igniting a rebellion. In the day she had given him, the old alchemist had moved through the dungeons like a phantom, using his knowledge and his status as a respected elder to organize the other Calorian prisoners. A small elite group of her father's most loyal soldiers had been identified and freed. Meanwhile, Tariq had sent a message, a coded note passed through a sympathetic kitchen servant, to a hidden contingent of Calorian knights who had escaped the final battle and taken refuge in the mountains. They were told to watch the highest tower of the fortress. When they saw a signal fire, they were to advance on a secret postern gate, a relic of the castle's older design that Isolde had discovered in her explorations. Now it was time to light that fire. Lysandra, her part in the drama far from over, was dispatched to the northernmost turret. As her small, lone figure ascended the tower, Isolde and her new band of 5 freed soldiers moved to execute the decapitation of the northern command. Their target was Jorund. They knew he would be in the main barracks, likely drunk and celebrating the Warlord's wedding. They moved through the castle with a ghostly efficiency, using the servant passages Isolde had mapped. They found Jorund just as they had predicted, roaring with laughter and ale. The fight was short and merciless. Faced with the sudden, shocking appearance of armed Calorians inside the fortress's most secure area, Jorund and the few men with him were caught completely off guard. When their brutish captain fell, the will of the others dissolved into chaos. At the same moment, across the castle, Isolde's hidden knights, seeing the signal fire blaze to life against the night sky, stormed the postern gate. They secured the main courtyard and the armory with stunning speed. The castle's command structure, reliant entirely on the singular authority of Cailan and the brutality of Jorund, had been broken in less than an hour. The remaining northern garrison, leaderless, confused, and cut off from their weapons, surrendered without a fight. By dawn, the coup was complete. The narrator would paint the scene in the great hall. On one side stood the disarmed Northmen, their faces a mixture of disbelief, fear, and sullen defeat. On the other stood the Calorians, freed from the dungeons, their thin frames filled with a dawning, incredulous joy. They were all gathered, a tense and volatile assembly waiting for the architect of this impossible victory to appear. Isolde entered. She wore not the dark silks of a northern bride, nor the fine gowns of a Calorian princess, but a simple, practical leather tunic and trousers. Her face was clean, her hair was tied back, and her bearing was that of a commander, not a queen. She walked to the center of the hall, to the space between the two peoples, and stood before them all. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong, echoing in the sudden absolute silence. The narrator would report her words, a speech that would become the foundation of a new kingdom. She did not speak of the vengeance she had just exacted. She did not gloat over the body of the tyrant. She spoke of the future. She looked at the Northmen and told them that the age of the Iron Wolf was over. She told them they would not be executed, that their families would not be harmed, that the cycle of blood for blood, of sons paying for the sins of their fathers, ended in this hall, on this day. They would be treated with the justice their own lord had denied the world. She then turned to her own people. She told them their suffering was at an end, but their work was just beginning. She told them that freedom was not a reward to be enjoyed, but a responsibility to be borne. They would not be masters any more than they would be slaves. They would be builders. She offered a choice to every person in that hall, Northman and Calorian alike. They could help her forge a new kingdom from the ashes of the old one, a kingdom built on law and mutual respect, not fear. Or they would be given provisions and safe passage to leave, to return to their former homes with no judgment and no retribution. When she finished, no one moved, no one spoke. The great hall, a place that had held the echoes of a tyrant's laughter only a day before, was now filled with a profound and heavy silence. The narrator would describe the expressions on the faces of the crowd, the stunned disbelief of the northern warriors who had expected only death, the cautious, hopeful wonder of the freed Calorians who had expected a bloody revenge. They were all looking at the woman who had been a prisoner, a ghost, a bride, and was now their conqueror. In the quiet, tense air of the hall, the future of a nation waited for a single person to choose a side. The silence in the great hall stretched for a lifetime. It was a fragile, crystalline thing, where the future of two peoples hung in perfect, uncertain balance. Then, from the ranks of the disarmed Northmen, an old, gray-bearded warrior, a man who had served Cailan for 40 years, took a slow, deliberate step forward. He laid his sheathed dagger on the stone floor, a symbol of his surrender not to a conqueror, but to an idea. One by one, others followed his lead. On the other side of the hall, a Calorian woman began to weep, not from sorrow, but from a profound and overwhelming relief. The tension broke, replaced by a wave of murmurs, of questions, of the first hesitant steps toward a new and unknown dawn. A year passed. The narrator would say that seasons have a way of washing away the memory of tyrants. The brutal northern winter gave way to a thaw, and for the first time in a generation, the spring that followed was one of peace, not of preparation for war. Drakenhold itself was transformed. The grim black banners of the Iron Wolf were gone, replaced by a new standard that flew from every turret, a golden Calorian sun, and a gray northern wolf, their emblems intertwined. The fortress, once a place of fear and shadow, had been opened. Its gates stood wide, and the courtyard that had once hosted executions now hosted a bustling marketplace. The air, once thick with the smell of soot and dread, now carried the scent of baking bread, the sound of children's laughter, and the unfamiliar music of Kylorians and Northmen haggling over wares. The change flowed from the queen. Isolde ruled not from a throne of iron and bone, but from a simple wooden chair in the great hall, which she had repurposed as an open court, accessible to all. The narrator would describe a typical morning, Queen Isolde listening patiently as a northern farmer and a Calorian woodsman brought a dispute over land boundaries before her. She heard both sides without interruption. Her questions sharp, her focus absolute. Her judgment, when it came, was not based on heritage or allegiance, but on the simple, unassailable logic of fairness. She proposed a solution that required a small concession from both men, but provided a greater benefit for their shared community. They accepted, not with the grudging obedience given to a tyrant, but with the grudging respect afforded to a true leader. She had been true to her word. Those who could not stomach the new peace, both Northmen loyal to, Kaelin's memory and Calorians unable to forgive, had been given provisions and allowed to leave. Her kingdom was smaller for it, but stronger, built not on forced fealty, but on a foundation of choice. Master Tariq now served as her chief adviser, his wisdom a guiding hand in the council. And Lysandra, no longer a terrified handmaiden, was the confident chatelaine of the castle, her authority unquestioned. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long golden fingers of light across the now peaceful lands, Isolde walked the battlements of Drakkenhold alone. These were the same stones that had once formed the walls of her cage, the same heights from which she had once looked out with a sense of utter hopelessness. Now she looked out upon a different world. She saw fields being planted where there had once been military encampments. She saw smoke rising from the chimneys of new homes where two peoples were learning to live as one. The narrator would reflect upon her incredible journey. She had worn scars to hide her face, only to learn that the true scars, the ones of hatred and tyranny, were those carried on the inside. She had sought a personal bloody vengeance, only to discover that the most profound victory was not in ending a life, but in building thousands of new ones. She had entered this fortress as a pawn, a ghost, a sacrifice. She now stood as its protector, its architect, its queen. She had faced the monster who tried to write her story as a tragedy and had, with a steady hand, authored her own triumphant ending. They tried to break her, to bury her under the weight of their injustice, to define her by the scars they gave her. But from that very earth she rose and forged a crown. Her story is a testament that hope can be a weapon, that courage can be a kingdom, and that even the darkest night must yield to the dawn. If her journey from a whisper to a roar has given you hope, subscribe and become part of this community. Your support ensures that more stories of strength, resilience, and justice can be told to a world that needs them. Isolde stood there until the last sliver of sunlight had faded, a lone, calm figure against the vastness of the sky. The wind that blew across the battlements was cold and clean, carrying not the ghosts of the past, but the promise of a peaceful tomorrow. Her work was not over, but the war was won, both within her and without. The queen was home,